So yeah, so because we are getting close to midterm, I also just want to kind of break down for y'all exactly what you're going to be graded on for the midterm grade, right? So we haven't actually gone through half of the material yet because midterm comes too early for that. What you will be graded on are the 4 homework assignments you've done, the 4 reflection papers you will have done, and your class participation, right? So that is what your midterm grade is going to encompass. And you know, I will say, like, you know, at least like of those of you who are here, right, none of you should be particularly worried about it. You know, you've all been showing up, you've been doing the work, you've been putting in the time and the elbow grease, right? So, you know, you should be all right. If there is a place where your grade seems a little bit low, it might be because some of you aren't always remembering to do the vocabulary exercise. But there'll be time for you to catch up on that in the second half of the semester if you've been forgetting to some of those words.
Do we have to turn the vocabulary in? Like, is there a due date for that? Because I've been doing both weeks whenever I do the reflection, or both readings.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just counting it when I see it. So if you're turning it in once a week instead of turning it in twice a week, yeah, then you're still getting the points. I'm still counting it. Yeah. As long as I'm getting them from you.
Do you want us to like say which passage the words came from?
It would help, but you don't have to. Yeah. I mean,
I have most of mine on the same document that I haven't turned in yet, but they're
okay,
like separated. Like,
okay.
This was from this passage.
Yeah. Don't worry about it. Just give me the document. Right? Okay. Just give me the document. You'll get the points. All right. Any other questions about your grades or about anything that's coming up? Okay. So starting next week, we're gonna start working on getting that first major paper together, right? So we're gonna be devoting most of our efforts in class to things that are gonna be geared towards getting that paper done. So I'll give you the specific assignment sheet for that on Tuesday. We'll talk through that a little bit, and then all the stuff we're gonna be doing in class. We're even gonna have, not next week, but the week after, an in-class writing day in the upstairs computer lab where you'll have the opportunity to do some drafting and ask me questions while you're doing it. Okay, so if nobody has any questions, and I'm assuming now that you don't. Okay, so I want to start again today with a little bit of free writing. But this time you will be free writing on your own, in part because with only 3 people, it seems pointless to do partners. So, the first thing I want you to do is take 5 minutes, and I want you to think about what education for profit means. And, you know, take every element of the term seriously, right? What is education? What is profit, right? Whose profit are we talking about? So just take 5 minutes, do some thinking on paper, and then we'll come back. What does education for profit mean? 2 minutes. Okay, that's time. All right, so let's just go across the line here and see what y'all said. Brandon, do you mind starting?
I put that it could mean on a smaller scale that if you educate yourself, you could get better or more profit financially.
Okay.
And then I put on a larger scale that it could mean educating more people will profit the entire world, revolutionizing problem solving lives.
Okay, so is that second definition you came up with there not necessarily an economic one? Are you thinking about other terms, other ideas of profit there as well? Are you still thinking about economic growth and economic profit?
Yeah, just more other things. Like,
Okay.
I would say, not technology-wise, but like,
Uh-huh.
kind of how we talked in like last class about like fixing our own problems. Like,
Okay.
Educate someone and work towards fixing it.
Okay, so you're thinking of profit here in terms of basically anything good, right? Not just in terms of, say, making money.
Yeah.
All right, interesting. Ron, what did you come up with? What have you got?
I actually pretty much put the same thing, except
Okay.
the second point was more economical.
Okay, so you were remaining with an economic definition of
Yeah.
profit. Okay. What about you, James?
Oh, I broke down the meaning.
What's that?
Education is receiving knowledge, learning something new, or taking previous knowledge and building on it for profit.
Okay.
Oh no, and building on it. For
Yeah.
profit is doing something for money. So education for profit is an act of receiving knowledge in the hopes of using it to make money. Education for profit is taking the fastest route for gains. Education for profit is being efficient against it.
Okay. So yeah, so you took my instructions the most literally and broke down the exact terms and what they meant. All right, good. And I think let's try to take and use some of James's breakdown here as well as we move into the second thing I want y'all to think about. I want you to take another 5 minutes. All right, we all saw this coming, yes? And I want you to take the other half of this binary term in Nussbaum's title and try to break down what you think this means. Right? What does it mean to educate for democracy? 2 more minutes. Time. So let's go the other way this time. James, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat my definition of education.
Sure.
So education is receiving knowledge, learning something new, or taking previous knowledge and building on it. And I said democracy is voting, democracy is the rule of everybody. So education for democracy is instruction in how democratic institutions work, history of democracy, philosophy of democracy, so that you can better participate in a democracy and so that the survival of democracy is ensured, or is assured.
Okay. So education for democracy then will be making sure people are well instructed in not only the history of particular institutions, but in how they operate. All right, good. Ron, what about you?
I put, it means like getting educated so you can be a better part of the democracy.
Okay. So education that allows you to participate in democratic life. Okay, good. And Brandon, what about you?
I said it's educating to inform people what may be going on in a specific subject so that a democracy where people vote on decisions, encourage people who are educated on the subject voice their opinions rather than people making decisions or arguments on the basis of claims.
Okay. So yeah, and I think that last part is actually really kind of good and interesting there, right? A lot of what educating for democracy means, right, is teaching people how to weigh different arguments, right? And how to make their case for the kinds of arguments that they want to make, right? So what I'd like us to think about here now for a second, right? Think about, the kinds of classes that you're taking, right? The kinds of subjects that you study now or have studied. And think about how you might divide them up, right? Which subjects would you file into the profit category, and which would you file into the democracy category?
Economics, profit.
Okay, you would put economics and profit? Okay, why would you put economics and profit, James?
Because we talk a lot about efficiency.
Okay.
Not only producing and stuff like that.
Okay, a lot about like efficiency and production, right? Is economics typically more about personal production and efficiency, or more about systems? So it is about understanding systems, right? So could one make the case that economics would also be democracy, so like something you might want to understand if you want to be a participant in democratic processes?
Yeah. But I think you'd have to strip some of the stuff we learned out of it first.
Yeah. You would teach it differently, right? Depending on what your aim is, sure. But I think that this is something this is like one of those rare examples maybe of a crossover discipline, right? What else are you guys taking? Like, where would you put the subjects you're taking otherwise? Okay. Yep. That's a pretty easy choice, right? Yeah, I mean, you are literally studying the institutions of government and how they work, right?
You put sociology and democracy probably.
Okay. Yeah, trying to understand, right, how society functions on a broad scale, right? And, you know, trends within a particular culture. All right, good. What else? What else would you put in each of these categories?
Let's do all our classes.
What's
You
that?
want all our classes?
Yeah. I really want to try to think this through.
I guess you could put math and profit.
Okay.
Or budgets.
Although, is there a good argument for putting mathematical reasoning in democracy as well? You got to be able to count, right? You got to be able to count higher than your 10 digits here. And even, you know, some understanding of, say, statistics, right, is often vital for understanding democratic function and democratic society. Where would you put a class like English?
Not this class.
Well, this class, or really, or, you know, if not this class, any English class. I mean, this probably isn't the only one you're taking, right?
I put this class in democracy.
You would put this class in democracy?
I think this class is more democracy, but some are more profit.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Like some classes are just like teaching you how to write and not
Okay.
reading
Okay, so-
books by other places and everything.
Okay, so if you're talking about a class that's kind of just teaching you the nuts and bolts of writing without any kind of critical analytical content, then you would sort of put that under profit because you're just kind of learning a basic skill. Whereas a class that's asking you to read and critically analyze things and write about them, you would put under democracy. Okay, and I think that I think that we are actually kind of seeing something here in these classes that we put under democracy, right? Is that these all do require some element of cultural analysis or social analysis, right? Or help us towards some kind of analysis of our society and our social our government or social situation. Whereas the kinds of classes that we might orient more towards profit are often more about kind of like teaching you a particular skill, right? So like, you know, when I say this, like I'm not trying to knock on, I'm not trying to knock on people in the pre-professional schools, right? But, you know, you look at, say, a class like accounting, right? Essentially, what is accounting? It's applied math, right? It's, you know, math applied to a particular business purpose. Nursing is applied biology, right? You know, marketing is essentially applied sociology. Advertising is applied psychology with elements of English and rhetoric as well, right? So most of the disciplines that we place in, say, pre-professional, you know, say like business schools, for example, are actually built out of the building blocks of these other liberal arts disciplines that we're kind of placing in the democracy category here. So this is just something that I want us all to think a little bit about as we proceed. Right now, the last thing I want you to think about before we kind of dig into the Nussbaum directly, just take another quick 5 minutes and think about which is more important, education for profit or education for democracy? And by the way, like, there's no right or wrong answer, and I'm not going to judge you based on what your answer is, right? I just want to know from you what you think is more important and why. I actually do give a shit. What do you think? Minutes. Okay, Ron, why don't you start us off this time?
I said that I think education for democracy is more important because it's pretty much the basis for the profit of both the individual and the government or
Okay.
everything else.
Okay, so you're providing a basis for a profitable society, whatever we decide that means, by educating people for their lives. Okay, Brandon, what about you? What do you think?
I said education for profit, and I said because it gets harder and more time consuming depending on what definition you put. Because I was thinking about like larger scale
Okay.
definition that I use for like educating people in specific fields for the benefit of like the entire world. Or
Yeah.
So
So
I
you
feel like it's more time consuming and harder rather than educating yourself to find yourself. You do that in a small time. Educating yourself.
Yeah, and I think part of what's going on, that your definition of profit is a little bit less distant from the definition of democracy than like Martha Nussbaum's is. I think that you are thinking of profit in terms of public good here as well, right? So, yeah, all right. James, what about you? What have you got?
I said the same thing as Ron, but I also said that it helps you look through different world, look at the world through different lenses, so,
Okay.
economic, social, historical, I guess mathematical, and also like different human experiences.
Okay.
That's why it's more important.
And yeah, I think that as we get into the Nussbaum essay, she's hitting on a lot of these same kinds of points, right? That, for example, one of the things that, like, one of the values she regards as central to democracy is sympathy for other human beings, right? And to provide a little bit of context for this idea of sympathy and a little bit for where that might be coming from. So, one thing that we can know, like, Nussbaum is like, she has a PhD in literature, but she's also a lawyer. So she's very much interested in the Western legal tradition. For reasons we'll get into in a minute, right? But this word sympathy, for people who study philosophy in particular, is a pretty deeply loaded word, right? So we talked today a lot about empathy, right? So what's empathy? When we're trying to get people to cultivate empathy, what are we trying to get them to do?
Feel bad for someone.
Yeah, with empathy specifically, we're trying not just to get them to feel bad for the person, right? We're trying to get them to feel what the other person feels, right? So empathy means feeling with. Sympathy means feeling for. So sympathy means kind of like being able to imagine what someone else is feeling without necessarily actually feeling it yourself, right? And this is something that comes out of 18th century philosophy. Right? In particular, a school called empiricism that we associate with people like John Locke, and David Hume. So we've mentioned Locke before in the context of social contracts, right? That he's the social contract thinker that the American system is in large part based on. But Locke was also a believer in empiricism. Does anybody know what empiricism is? What that means? How you think, like, so the word is completely unfamiliar, basically. Totally okay. And I totally expected that. So, here's what an empiricist believes, right? An empiricist believes that the only way we have to reliably gain knowledge is through our senses. Right? We can only trust our senses as guides to the world around us. The only things we can know for sure are the things we can sense. In fact, there are some empiricist thinkers who went so far as to argue that when we are not actually in this space and directly sensing it, we have no evidence that it exists. So, empiricist philosophers believe that sympathy was the basis of morality. That if you could imagine yourself in another person's position, that would lead you to treat that person more kindly, right? And with more care and consideration. So, for example, say, say a bomb, just for hypothetical here, right? Really hypothetical, not trying to harm anyone. Say a bomb goes off in that corridor over there, right? And we all need to go running in the other direction. What would be the Brandon gets in my way, right? What would be the fastest thing for me to do to get away from here?
Push it down.
Just push him out of my way, right? But according to this theory of sympathy, why would I avoid doing that? Why would I consider that an immoral action?
Because you want someone to do it to you.
What's that?
You want someone to do it to you.
Yeah, exactly, because I wouldn't want someone to do it to me, right? I know that if he did it to me, it would hurt and would put me in danger, right? And as such, I would not do that to him. So sympathy, like in the period in which much modern democratic theory is forming, is really, really key to ideas of morality. Now, yeah, go ahead, James.
I'm stuck on empiricism.
Okay.
Does memory count as like a sense?
Yes, but it's memory is unreliable for empiricists. Actually, so for just as a quick, I'm not going to go too deep down this rabbit hole. So Locke argues that the thing that kind of like keeps us that memory is actually what maintains our consistent identity, right? So say so I'm 43 years old now, right? I can remember as a kid, right, going to see Return of the Jedi in the movie theater. So because I can remember having done that as a child, right, I'm still the same person now at 43 that I was at age 5, right? However, there are things that we forget along the way as well, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's happened in between then that I don't remember. So memory becomes this kind of fuzzy hole where it's like, I'm the same person I was at 5, but maybe I'm not quite the same person I was at 22, right? And so on and so forth. So, yeah, you have actually kind of hit on like one of the problems in empiricism is, like if you take the idea to its logical extension. The other problem, if you take the idea to its logical extension, is that you can't be certain of anything. David Hume, for example, argued that the only reason we assume the sun is going to come up in the east every morning is because it always has. That there's no particular reason why it should. We take the evidence of our senses to stand in for universal laws that he says don't really exist. Does this make sense? Good, I'm glad. Because the first time I learned this shit, my brain nearly exploded. All right. So let's start having a look at Nussbaum then. Let's go to the very beginning of her essay. And because we're talking about this 18th century philosophical and constitutional tradition, I think it is important here to note what she begins the essay with, right? What are the very first things she gives us before she starts any kind of argument of her own at all?
The preamble of the Constitution of the United States of India.
Yep.
And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes, exactly. So she's giving us legal documents, right? Or excerpts from legal documents. All of which function as kind of like statements of values, right? And let's look at what values are expressed here. Can one of you please read for us on page 48 the excerpt from the preamble from the Constitution? The U.S. Constitution, that is.
Just the whole thing.
You just read the whole thing.
We
Yep.
the people.
Yep.
The people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote more the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Okay, thank you. So let's look and see what values are specifically enshrined here in this language, right? What specifically are we setting up this union to do, right? What words jump out at you?
Establish justice.
Justice, okay, good.
Tranquility.
Tranquility.
Defense.
Okay, defense, which is not capitalized, weirdly, unlike the others, right?
Prosperity.
Actually, is prosperity in there? Posterity, right? So future generations, right? So we should be thinking about posterity. We should be thinking about the generations to come. But it doesn't actually, apart from saying promote the general welfare, I think that what we want to focus on there is the word general, maybe more than the word welfare. And when we look at the word defense as well, what word precedes that?
Common.
Common. Yep, common defense, general welfare. And then when we're thinking about posterity, right, that plays into this as well, because what are we thinking about when we think about posterity? Are we thinking about ourselves? Well, kind of, but when we're talking about posterity, we're thinking about people not yet born, right? We're thinking about people yet to come. So I think what this has in common with common defense and general welfare is that we're thinking about a body of people, right? Rather than about an individual, right? The idea here is to form a more perfect union. So I think one could make a good case, particularly given the way I read most of the rest of Nussbaum's essay, that what she wants us to do with this, or what she wants us to get out of this, is this sense that the values expressed in the U.S. Constitution are supposed to be about promoting the common good rather than the individual good, right? Now, let's look at the Constitution of India, or the preamble from that. Can somebody read that for us, please?
We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to secure to all its citizens justice, economic and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, we hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution.
Okay, thank you, James. Okay, so let's take a minute with this and pick this one apart as well. What do we pull out of this?
To secure to all its citizens.
Pardon?
Secure to all its citizens.
Secure to all its citizens. In fact, the word all appears kind of a lot, doesn't it? So we once again have a sense here of a collective, right, or of a collective word. What else? Do we see places where this seems to be in dialogue with the U.S. Constitution?
Justice.
Okay, justice. Yep, justice recurs here. Liberty. Right. And liberty of what specifically?
Thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship.
Yeah, I think it's important that, what's guaranteed here is liberty of thought, right? So, liberty of thought in the Indian Constitution is inscribed as a specific value, right? Now, let's compare this to what she says a little bit later on in the essay about history education in India in the 2000s, right? We turn to page 53. Actually, let's start with the contextual paragraph. Let's start on page 52. Can I get somebody to start reading the bottom of the page? Says history, I said, might be essential.
History, I said, it might be essential, but educators for economic growth will not want a study of history that focuses on justice of class, caste, gender, and ethno-religious membership, because this will prompt critical thinking about the present. Nor will such educators want any serious consideration of the rising nationalism, of the damages done by nationalist ideas, and of the way in which the moral imagination too often becomes numbed under the sway of technical mastery. All things developed with scathing pessimism by Rabindranath Tagore and nationalism. Lectures delivered during the First World War,
Gotcha.
which are ignored in today's India, despite the universal fame of Tagore as Nobel Prize-winning author. So the version of history that will be presented will present national ambition, especially ambition for wealth as a great good, and will downplay issues of poverty and global accountability. Once again, real-life examples of this sort of education are easy to find.
Okay, so we'll pause here for a minute, right? And one of the reasons why I do like to focus on this part of it is because she is getting to a point at which she says the Indian Constitution is actually failing to live up to, or the Indian government is failing to live up to its constitutional promises. But also because this does actually reflect a lot of debate in K-12 and university education in the U.S. right now, right? Over the teaching of history, how U.S. history has become a really contested space between conservatives and liberals, right? I don't know, have any of you ever heard of a book by Howard Zinn called The People's History of the United States? If you have heard of the book, you've probably heard of it in terms of it, being banned as a school text in several states. Because it questions the usual narrative of sort of forward-moving American goodness and progress, right? So we get these we get these movements in these movements on school boards and whatnot, where people only want to teach what they say are the facts about history. And I'm sorry that the board is dirty and I just can't quite get it. But yeah, so when people say they only want you to learn the facts about history, what does that actually mean? Like, what do they actually want you to learn if we're thinking of history solely as facts?
Things that actually happen and not people's opinions on it.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's part of it, right? When we're talking about facts, then we're talking about, dates, right? This battle happened on this date, and this king reigned from this date to this date, right? Yeah, go ahead, James. What are you going to say?
So bridging question.
Yeah. Things that are presented as not open to question, right? When we think of something as a fact, right, we tend to think of a fact as something that is objectively true. Even though many of the things that we think of as objectively true are actually a lot fuzzier than we tend to believe them to be, right? So this is part of the issue in contemporary American history education, right? And let's see what the upshot is in India in the following paragraph. Can I get somebody to read, starting with a silent example of this approach to history?
A silent example of this approach to history can be found in textbooks created by the BJP, India's Hindu nationalist political party, which also pursues aggressively economic growth-based development. These books Now, unfortunately, gone since the BJP lost power in 2004. How to lose courage, critical thinking, and didn't even give the material to work. They presented India's history as a critical story of material and cultural decline in which all trouble was caused by outsiders and internal foreign elements. Criticisms of injustices in India's past was made virtually impossible by the content of the material and by its suggested
Pedagogy.
work. For example, the question at the end of each chapter, which discouraged thoughtful questioning and encouraged assimilation and regurgitation. Students were asked simply to absorb a story of unblemished goodness, bypassing all inequalities of faith, gender, and religion.
Does everybody know, by the way, what caste means? Okay, what's caste?
The like system of social hierarchy.
Yeah, essentially caste simply means social class, right? And traditionally in Hindu India, the caste system was fairly rigid, right? You're only supposed to caste determined, not only your social rank, but also what your likely job was, and who you were going to marry, and things of that sort. Right? People only married from their own caste. But yeah, broadly speaking, we're talking about your social class. So, what's she pointing out here about these BJP history textbooks? What's their only real purpose, according to Nussbaum?
To discourage the
Yeah. They don't want you thinking freely or critically, she says, about the facts of India's past, right? Because what might that lead you to do?
criticize
Question.
Yeah, you might criticize or question the way things are in the present as a result, right? And I think she's also pointing out something slightly ironic in the BJP's position, right? So who do the BJP history textbooks claim is responsible for all the problems that have ever happened in India's past?
outsiders.
Yeah, outsiders and foreign elements, right? And yet, what does she say about the BJP's economic program in the same paragraph?
She's economic growth-based returns, which usually involve foreign investment.
Exactly, yeah. Their whole thing is attracting foreign investment to India, right? While at the same time, they're also publishing and promoting these history textbooks that blame all of India's problems on foreigners, right? So she's presenting this almost as like a kind of sleight of hand that they do, right? Where it's like, don't look at what we're doing, look instead at, what's in the book here. So I point to these two paragraphs again because this is a place where I think Nussbaum is saying specifically that one of these governments is out of step with its stated values and traditions, right? But let's try to think about what she thinks is more broadly wrong with the relationship between education and economics. And let's go kind of back to the beginning of the essay for that. What does she seem to think about? What are her thoughts on economic development generally? Were you able to figure that out? What's her attitude towards economic development?
That it doesn't have any effect on education, so like the more economically developed, it's not an indicator of equality.
Okay, well, what's the problem? Yeah, so economic development is no indicator of educational quality or equality or anything like that, right? So what is she say? So is she saying that economic development itself is wrong? Is there something wrong with the measures we use to what measure does she have a problem with that we use to indicate levels of development? Okay, yeah, gross national product. Well, what does this mean? What is our gross national product? Yeah, this is like the aggregate of a country's total economic production, right? So what happens if we're only paying attention to the aggregate of what a country produces? What are we then not paying attention to?
The way it produces.
Yeah, we're maybe not paying attention to the way it produces, and that might hook up with Carson here, right? That, okay, yeah, sure, maybe you're producing tons and tons of wheat, but in order to do so, you're putting poisons into the ground that will mutate future generations, right? But there are also more pressing concerns in the present. If you look on page 49, she gives us an example of the kind of thing that she's talking about, right? One side of what this model leaves out is the fact that South Africa under apartheid used to shoot to the top of development indices. Do we know what apartheid was? I often tend to assume, because it was on the news so much when I was a kid, that everybody knows what this means. But I have to remember now that I'm teaching students who were born after it was abolished in South Africa. So maybe this doesn't mean as much to you. So does anybody know what this was? Okay, James, what was apartheid?
Well, it means apartness.
Yeah.
System of racial segregation.
Yeah, there was a very rigid system of racial segregation in South Africa prior to the 1990s, right? With a small group of white citizens at the top who were really the only ones who made any decisions or had any money. And below them were people of mixed race, below them were people of Asian descent, and below them were indigenous Africans, right? And where people could live was rigidly controlled, where people could go was rigidly controlled, and how many resources people had was also rigidly controlled, right? So there was a lot of wealth in the old South Africa, she says. And the old model of development rewarded that achievement or good fortune, ignoring the staggering distributional inequalities, the brutal apartheid regime, and the health and educational deficiencies that went with it. So this is an extreme example, right? But what is she saying that something like GNP doesn't actually, like, what does it not measure? Like, why can a country like South Africa be so brutally unequal, but still shoot to the top of economic development charts?
It doesn't measure. It only measures like one.
Yeah, it only measures one thing, right? And it doesn't measure how this thing is distributed. Right? It doesn't measure, like, just looking at GNP just tells you how much is being produced, right? It doesn't tell you about who has it, or whether people in a country have equal access to it, right? So that's the problem with GNP as a measurement that she's trying to point out here. And the problem she seems to see, like, with economic development as the primary end of education is that it tends to think in these same kinds of ways, right? That the idea is to try to maximize GNP without worrying about producing a citizenry that's actually kind of capable of asking for their actual rights. So, to give you an example of like how she thinks about this, right? The following paragraph. This model of development, the GNP model, right, has by now been rejected by many serious development thinkers, but it continues to dominate a lot of policy making, especially policies influenced by the United States. So what does this imply she thinks about policymakers? If she thinks this model of development has been rejected by most serious development thinkers, but policymakers are still adopting it, what does she say? What is she saying she thinks about policymakers? Okay, they don't pay attention to experts, right? And that maybe they themselves are not, right, serious development thinkers. That there's a divide here between people who make policy and people who actually study this shit, right? Especially, she points out, in the United States. So what this implies is a general kind of lack of respect for expertise. And I think that this is something that we can actually kind of take back to the Carson essay as well. There's a passage in Carson's piece that I want to, we didn't get to talk about last time, but I want to try to unpack a little bit now. And I really need to get better organized and remember where should I be. It's near the end. It's the last paragraph of Carson's essay, page 252. Can I get one of you to start reading that for us, starting with, there is still very limited awareness of the threat.
There is still very limited awareness of the nature of the threat. This is an era of specialists, each of whom sees his own problem and is unaware of or intolerant of the larger frame into which it fits. It is also an era dominated by industry, in which the right to make a dollar at whatever cost is seldom challenged.
Okay, so actually we can stop there. I think that's the important part that I want to focus on. Right. So what are the two things that she notes, or that Carson notes about her moment in the 20th century?
It's an era of specialists.
Okay, yeah, it's an era of specialists, right? What does it mean to be a specialist? We generally tend to think that expertise and knowledge are good things, right?
Who specialize in one area.
Yeah, a specialist is someone who is specialized in one area, right? Perhaps so much that they don't see the places where their area intersects with others, right? So specialization can also make you kind of blinkered. Now, what's the other point that she makes here? Who else? So it's an era of specialists, and it's dominated by whom? Yeah. Right, it's dominated by specialists who don't know or want to know anything outside their own fields, and it's dominated by industry who can pretty much just kind of tell the specialists what to do, right? Make this for us, do this for us. And I think that this is a problem, or that this is part of the problem that Nussbaum was trying to come up with a solution for, right? And I think that the solution she sees for this is in promoting liberal arts education, the kinds of subjects that we talked about as being the democracy subjects. Because, one thing that you may have already noted I hope you've noticed it, is that, like, we talk a lot about language in this class, right? But is it the only thing we talk about? I mean, today, we're talking about economics, right? We're talking about science, we're talking about law, and, when we talk about history. And these liberal arts disciplines are in some ways a kind of antidote to over-specialization, right? Because they all draw on each other, they all interact with one another. It's I like to think of English as a discipline, for example, as like, one in which it's good to know a little bit about a lot of things, right? It's a place where the things you're doing in a lot of the other classes comes together. And I think that is part of the value that Nussbaum sees in this particular model of education. So let's take it, we're close to being out of time here, but I want to look at the list of, her list of proposals for what she thinks education ought to teach you, right? What she thinks education ought to do for you. If you look on page 55, right? We have the ability to think well about political issues affecting the nation, to examine, reflect, argue, and debate, deferring to neither tradition nor authority. The ability to recognize fellow citizens as people with equal rights, even though they may be different in race, religion, gender, and sexuality. To look at them with respect as ends, not just as tools to be manipulated for one's own profit. The ability to have concern for the lives of others, to grasp what policies of many types mean for the opportunities and experiences of one's fellow citizens of many types, and for people outside one's own nation. The ability to imagine well a variety of complex issues affecting the story of a human life as it unfolds. To think about childhood, adolescence, family relationships, illness, death, and much more in a way informed by an understanding of a wide range of human stories, not just by aggregate data. The ability to judge political leaders critically, but with an informed and realistic sense of the possibilities available to them. The ability to think about the good of the nation as a whole, not just that of one's own local group. And finally, the ability to see one's own nation in turn as part of a complicated world order in which issues of many kinds require intelligent transnational deliberation for their resolution. So, much like Confucius's philosophy, all kind of comes down to the simple notion of reciprocity in the end, right? Treat others appropriately and it will come back to you. I think there is a single thread running through all of Nussbaum's ideas here as well, right? What is that single thing that unites all of these ideas together? What's the single base idea at the bottom of all of this? Sorry, it's David Bowie telling me I need to wrap up. What's that? Well, this is what she thinks education is supposed to do for you, right? These are the skills that education is supposed to help you develop.
Resolution.
What do you mean by resolution?
Like deliberation for resolution.
Okay. To be able to resolve problems peacefully, certainly, right? If you want to resolve a difference with somebody peacefully, though, how do you have to regard them? Yeah, you have to regard them as just as important and just as human as yourself, right? So that S word from the beginning of the period, ultimately, is what everything comes back around to, right? You can't do any of this without cultivating a sense of sympathy for other people, without cultivating a sense of common humanity, right? Okay, so we are out of time. Does anybody have any questions about it? We all know what we need to do for next time and what is expected for midterm and all that shit. All right, great. So you're free to go. Have yourselves a good weekend.